Young attorney Marcus Reed walked into a federal courtroom carrying more than files. He carried a truth no one wanted revealed. Too young, too quiet, too black, some thought. A judge dismissed him with a smirk. Corporate lawyers laughed, and the room decided the case was already over. What they didn't know was that Marcus held evidence powerful enough to shake a billion-dollar company and expose the people protecting it. This is a story about prejudice, courage, and how silence can be the sharpest weapon of all. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The morning air in Portland, Oregon, carried the damp chill of early spring. A light drizzle clung to the streets, softening the city's edges and turning the courthouse steps into slick gray stone. Clouds hung low, heavy and unmoving, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Commuters hurried past with collars raised, umbrellas tilted against the rain, unaware that inside the federal courthouse, a quiet collision was about to begin. Marcus Reed paused at the base of the steps. He was 26 years old, tall but slightly lean, with a narrow frame that still carried the softness of youth. His skin was a deep, even brown, unmarked by age but shaped by long nights and longer thoughts. His hair was cropped short and neat, not out of style but never flashy, and his face, smooth, clean-shaven, made him look younger than he was. Too young, some would say, to be standing where he was about to stand. He wore a navy suit that fit well but not expensively, the kind bought on sale after passing the bar exam. The sleeves were pressed sharp, the tie carefully knotted, his shoes polished just enough to show effort without pretense. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase, darkened at the corners, the handle softened by years of use that didn't belong to him alone. It had once belonged to his father. Inside that briefcase were documents no one else in the building wanted to see. Marcus took a breath, steady and deliberate. His expression was calm, not because he was fearless, but because he had learned early that showing nerves invited the wrong kind of attention. He climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The security checkpoint was already busy. Lawyers in tailored suits passed through without slowing, exchanging nods with officers who recognized them by face and reputation. Marcus stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt. The officer at the scanner stopped him with a raised hand. The officer's name tag read, Harlan, a man in his late 40s with a stocky build and a permanent crease between his brows. His uniform strained slightly at the shoulders, and his posture suggested someone who had worked the same post long enough to stop questioning his assumptions. He glanced at Marcus, then at the briefcase, then back at Marcus again. "Hold up," Harlan said, voice flat. "Defendants check in down the hall." Marcus blinked once. "I'm counsel," he replied calmly. Harlan's eyes flicked over Marcus again, his face, his age, his hands. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, skeptical. "Counsel," he repeated as if testing the word. "For who?" "For the plaintiffs," Marcus said. He slid his bar card across the counter without drama. Harlan picked it up, studying it longer than necessary. A few people in line behind Marcus shifted impatiently. When the officer finally handed it back, there was no apology in his expression, just a shrug. "Don't wander," Harlan muttered. "Courtroom B." Marcus nodded once and moved on. Inside Courtroom B, the space was already filling. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of quiet conversations. The air smelled faintly of polished oak and old paper, layered with the subtle tension that always hovered before a major case. At the front, elevated behind the bench, sat Judge Robert Claiborne. Claiborne was 68, a broad man with thinning silver hair and a face carved by years of authority. His robe draped heavily over his shoulders, and he leaned back in his chair as if the room itself belonged to him. His eyes were sharp, pale blue, the kind that had learned to look through people rather than at them. In legal circles he was known as efficient, decisive, and, when pressed, unforgiving. When Claiborne's gaze landed on Marcus, it lingered just long enough to form a conclusion. Then his mouth curved slightly. Not a smile, but something close to it. At the defense table sat Daniel Whitmore and Charles Whitman, lead attorneys for North River Foods. Whitmore was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked lightly with gray at the temples. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and moved with practiced ease, the confidence of a man accustomed to winning. Whitman, younger but no less polished, had a sharp jawline and cold eyes that missed nothing. Both men leaned back in their chairs as Marcus approached the plaintiff's table. Whitmore glanced at Whitman, then toward Marcus. A half-smile crossed his face. "Is this the associate?" Whitman murmured, not bothering to lower his voice. Whitmore chuckled softly. "Must be." Marcus set his briefcase down and straightened his papers without looking at them. He felt the weight of the room settle around him. Not hostility exactly, but dismissal. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. In the front row sat Eleanor Brooks, a woman in her early 50s. She was small, with tired eyes and hands folded tightly in her lap. Her hair, once dark, was now threaded heavily with gray and pulled back in a simple clip. She wore a modest coat, worn at the cuffs, and clutched a folded tissue as if afraid to let go. Eleanor was the mother of one of the plaintiffs. She leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and whispered, "He looks so young." Her voice carried worry, not judgment. "Younger than my son was." The woman nodded silently. A few rows back, Lena Morales, a local investigative reporter, sat with a notebook balanced on her knee. In her mid-30s, Lena had sharp features and alert brown eyes that missed little. She wore a plain jacket and low boots, blending easily into the crowd. When she noticed the exchange at the security checkpoint, and later the judge's expression, she made a small note in the margin of her pad. Not about the case, about the lawyer. The clerk called the room to order. Judge Claiborne adjusted his glasses and looked down at the docket. "Counsel ready?" he asked. Whitmore stood smoothly. "Ready for the defense, Your Honor." Marcus rose next. "Ready for the plaintiffs, Your Honor." Claiborne's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You are." "Marcus Reed," he said, "attorney for the plaintiffs." There was a brief pause. Claiborne shuffled the papers in front of him, scanning names. "Mr. Reed," the judge said at last, "you're appearing alone." "Yes, Your Honor." Claiborne leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "This is a complex environmental liability case," he said. "Not a small claims hearing?" "I understand," Marcus replied evenly. Claiborne nodded once, unimpressed. "Very well, let's proceed." Whitmore smirked openly now. What none of them knew, what no one in that room could yet see, was that inside Marcus Reed's briefcase were internal waste disposal logs, financial transfers, and timestamps that, once exposed, would send North River Foods stock into freefall before the market closed. And the kid they had already dismissed was the only one who knew how to use them. Marcus Reed stood at the plaintiff's table as the clerk finished reading the case title aloud. The words echoed through the courtroom. Formal, distant, stripped of the lives they represented. Residents of Millstone versus North River Foods Corporation. To most people in the room, it sounded like another dry environmental dispute. To Marcus, it sounded like the names of neighbors who no longer slept through the night, children who swallowed pills before breakfast, and funerals that came too early. Millstone was a small river town tucked along the banks of the Elk Crow River, 3 hours south of Portland. Once, it had been known for fishing docks, canneries, and summer festivals that smelled of grilled corn and river air. Now, it was known for something else. Over the past 5 years, liver failure rates had tripled. Rare bile duct cancers appeared in people who had never smoked, never drank. Doctors whispered, families connected dots, and always, upstream, stood North River Foods' massive processing plant, humming day and night. Marcus cleared his throat and began. He spoke plainly at first, careful not to rush. He described how waste from the plant, chemical preservatives, cleaning solvents, byproducts of mass canning, had been discharged into the Elk Crow River without proper treatment. He explained how residents use that water for washing, irrigation, even drinking when the town's aging pipes failed. He named dates. He named symptoms. He named people. Judge Robert Claiborne listened with a posture that suggested patience but conveyed none. He leaned back, one elbow resting on the bench, fingers tapping lightly as Marcus spoke. "Your Honor," Marcus said, lifting a document. "This is a water quality report taken independently by a certified environmental lab. It shows—" "Sustained," Claiborne interrupted before Marcus could finish. "Speculation." Marcus paused. "Your Honor, this is not speculation. The lab—" "I've ruled," the judge said flatly. "Move on." A faint ripple of amusement passed across the defense table. Daniel Whitmore rose smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "If I may clarify for the court," he said, his voice warm and confident, "what opposing counsel is attempting to do is draw a causal line without meeting the legal burden required under Dobert standards. Correlation does not equal causation." Charles Whitman stood beside him, already prepared, adding, "Particularly in environmental cases, Your Honor, where multifactorial health outcomes are involved." Their words flowed easily, polished, dense, intimidating. They cited case law from memory, referencing precedents from other circuits, studies with titles too long to remember. Marcus watched the jury as they spoke. Several leaned back, brows furrowed, pens slowing. Confusion was settling in. This was the strategy. Overwhelm, obscure, exhaust. Marcus stood again. "The residents of Millstone are not scientists," he said calmly. "They are fishermen, teachers, factory workers. But what they know is that their water changed, and then their bodies did." Whitmore smiled faintly. "A compelling story," he said, turning toward the jury, "but stories are not evidence." Judge Claiborne nodded. "The court agrees." Marcus felt it then, not anger, not yet, but the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense of being pushed back, not by argument, but by dismissal. As Whitmore continued, Marcus's attention drifted for a moment, pulled backward by memory. He saw his father again, not as he was at the end, but as he had been when Marcus was 10. Samuel Reed, broad-backed, hands permanently rough from unloading crates at the Millstone docks. A quiet man with a steady laugh, who smelled of river water and metal. Samuel had worked those docks for 20 years, hauling pallets from barges that came down the Elk Crow. When his liver failed, the doctors had shrugged. "Idiopathic," they said. "No clear cause. Too many possibilities." Marcus remembered sitting beside the hospital bed, watching his father's skin yellow, listening to the machines. Remembered the guilt that came later when the pattern in Millstone became impossible to ignore. He blinked, pulling himself back into the courtroom as Whitmore concluded. "Therefore," Whitmore said, "the defense maintains that while the plaintiff's situation is unfortunate, it is not actionable." Judge Claiborne nodded again. "The court will strike the prior exhibit. Proceed." In the second row, Eleanor Brooks clenched her tissue tighter. Her eyes never left Marcus. A few seats behind the defense table sat Evan Liu, a junior attorney from a small civil firm observing the proceedings. Evan was 28, slim, with wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that looked borrowed rather than owned. He had come hoping to learn. As he watched Marcus stand alone against two senior corporate litigators and a skeptical bench, something in his expression shifted, from curiosity to quiet respect. But when his supervising attorney glanced back at him, Evan lowered his eyes. Admiration stayed unspoken. Marcus pressed on, introducing testimony from medical records, affidavits from residents. Each time, Claiborne narrowed the scope, limiting relevance, questioning foundation. Each time, Whitmore and Whitman were ready, objecting with precision, their timing flawless. By midday, the jury looked tired. During a brief recess, Marcus stepped into the hallway, loosening his tie slightly. The courthouse buzzed with murmured conversations, phones vibrating, shoes echoing on marble. He leaned against the wall for a moment, closing his eyes. Nearby, Lena Morales pretended to scroll through her phone while watching him. She noted the way he stood alone, how no one approached him, how different that looked compared to the defense's circle of quiet confidence. She added another note to her pad. When court resumed, Marcus returned to his place, shoulders squared. He knew how this looked. A young lawyer overmatched, a case no one took seriously. What they didn't see, what they couldn't yet, was that Marcus wasn't arguing theory. He was building a record. And records, once complete, had a way of outliving smirks and dismissals. The judge called the session to a close earlier than expected. "Court will recess until tomorrow," Claiborne said. "Counsel are reminded to review admissibility standards." The gavel struck. Conversations erupted immediately. Whitmore laughed softly as he gathered his papers. "Long day for you," he said to Marcus in passing. "Environmental law is tricky. You'll learn." Marcus met his gaze. "I already have." Whitmore's smile faltered just slightly, then returned. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor Brooks approached Marcus hesitantly. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "For trying." Marcus nodded. "I won't stop." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The Elk River flowed unseen in the distance, carrying secrets no one in that courthouse was ready to face. Not yet. The second morning of hearings began with a strange calm. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, pale and almost gentle, as if the city outside had decided to behave. Marcus Reed arrived early, standing alone at the plaintiff's table while the room slowly filled. He laid out his files carefully, each document aligned, each tab placed where his hand would find it without hesitation. If the courtroom was a battlefield, then preparation was the only armor he had left. He began with the waste-handling logs. "These records," Marcus said, holding up a thick binder, "document daily chemical disposal volumes at the North River Foods processing plant over a 3-year period. They show repeated exceedances." "Objection," Daniel Whitmore said immediately, already on his feet. "Foundation and relevance." Judge Robert Claiborne barely looked up. "Sustained." Marcus didn't argue. He moved on, just as he had planned. Next came the shipping contracts. Agreements between North River and a small, obscure transport company that specialized in nighttime waste removal. Marcus explained how the contracts used coded language, how disposal destinations were left deliberately vague. "Objection," Charles Whitman said, smooth and practiced. "Speculative interpretation." "Sustained," Claiborne replied, his voice clipped. "Unless counsel can prove intent." Marcus nodded again, face unreadable. He turned the page. Then came the satellite imagery. Large, color-printed maps appeared on the courtroom screen. They showed the Elk River winding past the plant, and darker plumes spreading downstream after midnight discharges. Marcus pointed to timestamps, coordinates, overlays matched with production schedules. "This data," he said, "comes from an independent satellite provider. It correlates precisely with—" "Objection," Whitmore cut in, almost bored now. "Improper expert testimony." Claiborne leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. "Mr. Reed," he said, "the court has already warned you about speculative correlations. This is not a scientific symposium." Marcus felt it then. The final shift. The realization settling into place with a quiet certainty. This wasn't caution. It was protection. He looked up at the bench, meeting Claiborne's eyes directly. For a brief second, something unreadable passed between them. Then the judge looked away. "Strike the exhibit," Claiborne said. "Move on." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Eleanor Brooks shook her head slowly, disbelief etched into her tired face. At the defense table, Whitmore leaned back, satisfied. Whitman scribbled something on a legal pad, lips curved faintly upward. As the morning wore on, the pattern became undeniable. Evidence from Marcus was cut short, reframed, minimized. Evidence from North River sailed through with minimal scrutiny. The rules were the same, but their application was not. During a short recess, Marcus remained seated, staring at the empty witness stand. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger clouded judgment. What he felt instead was clarity. This was no longer about whether North River had polluted the river. It was about who the system chose to believe. Outside the courthouse, something else was happening. At precisely 10:47 a.m., North River Foods' stock ticker nudged upward, just 0.5%. To most people, it meant nothing. To analysts watching closely, it meant confidence. Someone, somewhere, believed the risk had passed. In a small office across town, a junior market analyst frowned at her screen. The case was ongoing. No ruling had been made. And yet the stock moved as if the outcome were already priced in. Back in the courthouse, Harold Finch watched everything from his station near the clerk's desk. Finch was 72, thin as a rail, with stooped shoulders and hands that trembled slightly when he poured his morning coffee. He had worked in that building for nearly 4 decades, first as a messenger, then as a clerk's assistant. He wore the same gray suit every day, pressed meticulously and spoke rarely unless spoken to. People tended to overlook him, which suited him just fine. But Finch had seen judges come and go. He had seen arrogance, corruption, and quiet courage, and he had learned the difference between impatience and intent. As he watched Judge Claiborne dismiss yet another exhibit without deliberation, Finch's brow furrowed. Not deeply, just enough to mark the moment. When the lunch recess was called, Finch moved slowly through the courtroom, collecting documents left behind. As he passed Marcus's table, he paused for half a second longer than necessary. His eyes flicked to the rejected binders, the careful organization. "Long road," Finch said quietly, his voice dry but not unkind. Marcus looked up, surprised. "It is." Finch nodded once, then moved on. That afternoon, Marcus tried one last approach. He attempted to enter internal email summaries, redacted but telling, showing executives discussing containment costs versus regulatory exposure. Whitmore objected before the first sentence was complete. Claiborne sighed, as if bored. "Counsel," he said, "we are not here to conduct a fishing expedition." Marcus closed the folder slowly. For the first time, he didn't immediately respond. The courtroom waited. He straightened his tie, then spoke carefully. "Your Honor," he said, "with respect, the pattern of exclusions." "Enough," Claiborne snapped. "The court has ruled. Sit down, Mr. Reed." Marcus complied. But inside, something hardened. This was not a fair fight. It was not even a crooked one conducted quietly. It was open, confident, unafraid of consequence. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Whitmore and Whitman left, laughing softly, already checking their phones. Marcus gathered his things alone. In the gallery, Lena Morales typed rapidly on her laptop, eyes sharp. She wasn't writing about pollution anymore. She was writing about power. Finch lingered near the bench after the room emptied, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. He glanced once more at the judge's chair, then at the door through which Marcus had exited. For the first time in years, Harold Finch felt the old unease return, the kind that told him a line had been crossed. Marcus stepped out into the late afternoon light, the courthouse doors closing heavily behind him. The Elk Crow River flowed on unseen, carrying its buried truths downstream, and somewhere beneath layers of procedure and precedent, a system worked very hard to keep those truths buried. Night fell hard over Portland, the kind of cold, wet darkness that pressed against windows and made even familiar streets feel hostile. Marcus Reed's office sat above a closed hardware store on the east side, a narrow space with peeling paint and a single, flickering fluorescent light. It wasn't much. 2 desks, a metal filing cabinet, a thrift store bookshelf. But it was his. Or at least, it had been. He unlocked the door and knew something was wrong before he stepped inside. The air smelled sharp and chemical, like solvent and dust stirred too fast. His foot nudged a chair that should have been tucked under the desk. The light switch clicked, and the room revealed itself in pieces. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered like fallen leaves, the printer tipped on its side. His laptop lay on the floor, screen spiderwebbed, the casing bent as if someone had brought a heel down on it with intention. Marcus stood still, breathing slowly, counting. He moved through the room without touching anything, the way he had learned to move through chaos. Observe first, react later. The filing cabinet was open. Several folders were missing, not all of them, just the ones that mattered. He sank into the chair and rubbed his face with both hands. For the first time since the trial began, the calm cracked. The phone rang. He stared at it, then answered. "Hello." A man's voice came through low and unhurried, not rushed, not nervous. "Mr. Reed, busy night." "Who is this?" Marcus asked. A soft chuckle. "Someone who appreciates efficiency. Let's skip the part where you pretend this surprises you." Marcus said nothing. "We're prepared to make this easy," the voice continued. $300,000, wired tomorrow morning. You withdraw the complaint, cite insufficient evidence, walk away. Marcus closed his eyes. "And if I don't?" he asked. There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Your mother lives alone, doesn't she?" the man said. "Nice neighborhood. Quiet street." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Don't." "Relax," the voice said smoothly. "No one wants trouble, but accidents happen, cars slide, stairs are missed. We'd rather avoid unpleasantness." The line went dead. Marcus sat there long after, the phone still pressed to his ear. His hands trembled, not with fear alone, but with rage he didn't trust himself to release. He stood and paced, then stopped in front of the bookshelf. A framed photograph lay face down beneath a pile of papers. He picked it up. It was old, the edges worn soft. His father stood on the riverbank of the Elk Crow, boots muddy, sleeves rolled, a grin caught mid-laugh. The river behind him was wide and bright then, full of life. Marcus remembered that day, the smell of fish, the way the town gathered by the water, how everything felt possible. He sat on the floor and held the frame against his chest. For a moment, just one, he imagined taking the money, paying off his debts, protecting his mother, letting the case dissolve into silence like so many others. He felt the weight of exhaustion settle in, heavy and persuasive. Across the city, Lena Morales stared at her laptop in her apartment, coffee gone cold beside her. She had spent the evening pulling records, campaign donations, regulatory filings, environmental waivers. North River Foods appeared again and again, always just within the lines of legality, always adjacent to decision-makers. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, and patterns had a way of breaking when pressed hard enough. She opened a new document and titled it, Who Benefits? Back in his office, Marcus stood and wiped his face. He checked the locks, photographed the damage, backed up what he could from a cloud account he'd set up months earlier, just in case. He packed the remaining files into his briefcase, then hesitated, glancing at the photograph once more. He slid it into the case. Outside, rain tapped steadily on the sidewalk, the city breathing in and out around him. Marcus turned off the light and pulled the door shut, unsure of what the morning would bring, only certain of what the night had taken. Marcus Reed did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table as dawn crept into Portland, The city washed pale by rain and streetlight glare. His phone lay face up beside a mug of untouched coffee. Every vibration from the building pipes made his shoulders tense. The threat still rang in his ears, not loud, but precise, designed to linger. He had packed his remaining files into a single briefcase and moved them twice, as if motion alone could keep them safe. At 6:18 a.m., the phone rang. The number was blocked. Marcus answered on the second ring. "This is Marcus Reed." There was breathing on the line before the voice came. Female, controlled but strained, like someone holding themselves together by habit rather than hope. "You don't know me," the woman said. "But I know you. I watched you in court yesterday." Marcus stood slowly. "Who is this?" "My name is Emily Carter." She spoke quickly now, afraid the courage would fade. Emily Carter was 34, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a runner's build that came from years of walking city streets instead of sleeping. Her hair, once chestnut and carefully kept, had been cut short in a bathroom mirror months earlier. She had sharp features softened by exhaustion, and eyes that never stopped scanning rooms. Fear had reshaped her posture. She leaned away from windows, kept her back to walls. She had learned these habits after North River. "I was an environmental engineer at North River Foods," Emily said. "Senior compliance until 2 years ago." Marcus closed his eyes. "Why are you calling me?" "Because they're lying," she said. "And because they think you don't matter." The words landed heavier than she intended. Emily explained in fragments at first, then with increasing clarity as Marcus listened without interruption. She described internal meetings held after midnight, rooms with no windows and phones left outside. She described charts that showed rising toxicity downstream, and executives who circled numbers in red and asked only one question: cost. "I recorded one of those meetings," she said. "Audio only. I wasn't supposed to, but I knew someday I'd need it." Marcus leaned against the counter. "Do you still have it?" "Yes," Emily said. "Encrypted, offline. They wiped the servers, but they couldn't wipe my recorder." "What's on the recording?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "The truth," she said. They knew the chemicals caused liver damage. They knew it increased cancer risk. And they chose to bury it. One of them actually said it was cheaper to settle than to treat. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. "Emily," he said carefully, "why didn't you come forward sooner?" There was a pause. Then softly, "Because I signed an NDA. Because they paid me. Because they told me if I talked, they'd make sure I never worked again." "And?" Marcus asked. "And because I was tired," she admitted. "Tired of fighting people who don't lose." She told him where she was calling from. An extended stay motel off the highway, paid in cash. She moved rooms every few nights. She trusted no one. She hadn't told her family. Every time a car slowed outside, she froze. Marcus listened until she finished. "I can help you," he said finally, "but it won't be safe." Emily laughed once, bitter. "It's not safe now. If you testify," Marcus continued, "we can seek immunity, whistleblower protection, witness security if necessary." "You promise?" she asked. "I promise to try," he said. "And I don't promise what I can't fight for." There was a silence on the line, heavy but steadier than before. "There's something else," Emily said. "Something you should know before you decide." Marcus waited. "One of the names on the recording," she said, "is connected to the court, financially." Marcus straightened. "Say that again." "There's a judge," Emily said. "I don't know how deep it goes, but I saw a disclosure memo. Stock holdings, deferred compensation, North River stock, not through the company, through a trust." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "Judge Robert Claiborne?" Emily exhaled slowly. "Yes." Across town, Lena Morales stared at a spreadsheet on her screen, her jaw set. She had spent the night cross-referencing public disclosures with trading activity. The pattern was subtle, buried under layers of compliance, but it was there. A family trust tied to Claiborne, periodic trades aligned suspiciously close to regulatory decisions involving North River. She saved the file twice. Back in Marcus's kitchen, the sky brightened. "Emily," he said, "I need you to stay where you are. Don't contact anyone else. I'll call you back today." "Please," she said, "don't let them make this disappear." "I won't," Marcus said, and for the first time since the office break-in, he meant it. When the call ended, Marcus stood quietly absorbing the weight of what had just changed. The case was no longer a question of pollution alone. It was a question of corruption. Outside, traffic began to move. Portland woke up. Marcus picked up his briefcase and headed for the door, the fear still there, but now matched by something stronger. Purpose. The final day of hearings began under a hard, cloudless sky. Portland felt unusually quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that settled in before something irreversible happened. Marcus Reed arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. He wore the same navy suit, the same worn briefcase in his hand, but something in his posture had changed. He was no longer bracing himself against the room. He was preparing to confront it. Inside Courtroom B, the atmosphere was confident, on one side only. Daniel Whitmore and Charles Whitman sat relaxed at the defense table, jackets unbuttoned, voices low and amused. Their legal team clustered behind them, laptops open, whispering updates about media coverage and market movement. North River Foods stock had held steady overnight. To them, the case was already over. Judge Robert Claiborne took the bench with his usual authority, but his eyes flicked briefly to the gallery before settling forward. He looked tired. Not physically, he had slept, but mentally, as if something unseen had followed him into the room. Marcus waited until the clerk finished the formalities. Then he stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. Before the defense proceeds, the plaintiffs move to reopen their case. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Whitmore rose instantly. "Objection," he said. The plaintiffs rested. "This is highly irregular." "Denied," Claiborne said without hesitation. "Proceed, Mr. Whitmore." Marcus did not sit. "Your Honor," he continued, "this motion is based on newly discovered evidence and a material witness who was previously unavailable." Claiborne's jaw tightened. "Mr. Reed, I will not—" "And this court," Marcus said, raising his voice just enough to carry, "has an obligation to hear it." Silence fell, not polite silence, the kind that presses against the ears. Claiborne stared down at him. "You are out of line," he said sharply. "Sit down before I hold you in contempt." Marcus didn't move. "There is an audio recording," he said, "documenting North River Foods executive leadership knowingly concealing evidence of chemical harm to the residents of Millstone." Whitmore's smile vanished. "That recording," Marcus continued, "is in the possession of a former North River environmental engineer who is present in this building." Claiborne's hand tightened around his pen. "There is no such witness on the record." "There is now," Marcus said. At the rear of the courtroom, a side door opened quietly. Emily Carter stepped inside. She moved cautiously, shoulders slightly hunched, as if expecting someone to grab her from behind. She wore a plain gray coat, her short hair tucked behind her ears, her face pale but set with resolve. She looked thinner than she had weeks ago, exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, but there was something steadier in her gaze now. Fear had shaped her, but it no longer owned her. She had entered through the judge's technical access corridor, a route few people knew existed, bypassing the main security checkpoints. The only reason she had made it that far was because Harold Finch, the elderly court clerk, had quietly unlocked the door and nodded her through without a word. Finch stood near the wall now, hands clasped behind his back, his heart pounding. He had made a choice this morning, after decades of watching rules bent and broken in silence. This time, he had picked a side. A murmur swept the room. Jurors leaned forward. Pens appeared in hands that had been idle for days. Whitmore turned slowly, disbelief written across his face. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "Your Honor, this witness is unvetted. This is a clear violation." Claiborne didn't answer him. The judge was staring at Emily. His face had lost color. A thin sheen of sweat glistened along his hairline, his composure cracking in ways Marcus had never seen before. He knew that look now. It wasn't irritation. It was recognition. Marcus seized the moment. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiffs move to admit Exhibit Z." He nodded to the clerk. The courtroom screens flickered to life. A waveform appeared first, then audio. A conference room. Voices, casual, confident. "If we shut the plant down to redesign waste treatment, we're looking at hundreds of millions," a man said. Another voice replied, sharper. "And if we don't, then we settle," the first voice said. "Litigation costs are cheaper than environmental remediation." Gasps erupted from the gallery. The recording continued. Names were mentioned. Timelines. Deliberate decisions. Laughter. The jurors were no longer passive observers. They were leaning forward now, writing furiously, eyes fixed on the screen. One woman pressed her hand to her mouth. Another shook his head slowly as if trying to process the depth of what he was hearing. Whitmore sat frozen. Claiborne's gavel hovered in his hand, forgotten. "This recording," Marcus said evenly, "was made by Ms. Carter while she was employed by North River Foods. She attempted to raise concerns internally and was silenced." Claiborne swallowed. This court cannot allow." Before he could finish, Finch moved. He stepped out from the wall and lifted a phone to his ear, his hands trembling but steady enough to dial. He spoke quietly, urgently, to a number he had memorized years ago but never used. "Federal oversight," he said. "I believe you'll want to hear this." Marcus watched Claiborne as realization dawned. The judge's authority, so absolute days ago, now looked fragile, like glass under pressure. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. For the first time, Claiborne looked at Marcus not with dismissal, but with something close to fear. Court was no longer under his control. The verdict came back just after noon, when sunlight poured through the courthouse windows and turned the dust in the air into drifting gold. The jury filed in with a gravity that needed no announcement. They looked neither triumphant nor hesitant, only resolved. Marcus Reed stood at the plaintiff's table, hands resting on the worn leather of his briefcase, feeling the quiet hum in his chest that came when fear finally loosened its grip. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver hair pulled into a neat knot, rose and cleared her throat. Her voice was steady as she read, on negligence, on fraudulent concealment, on willful violation of environmental statutes, on conspiracy. Each count fell like a measured blow. Liable, 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 liable. A hush followed, broken only when the damages were announced. Compensatory damages first, enough to rebuild lives, fund treatment, restore dignity. Then punitive damages, the number stretching beyond what the defense had dared imagine. More than $1 billion. The sum landed in the room with a weight that bent spines and stilled breath. Eleanor Brooks pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely now. She reached for Marcus without looking, and he covered her trembling fingers with his own. Around them, the gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, muffled sobs. At the defense table, Daniel Whitmore sat rigid, his jaw slack, eyes unfocused. Charles Whitman stared at the floor, pen rolling from his fingers to the carpet. Judge Robert Claiborne did not move. He sat frozen, a man suddenly too aware of the spotlight. The authority he had worn like a second skin had peeled away, leaving something pale and exposed beneath. Before he could speak, the rear doors opened. They entered with purpose. Men and women in dark jackets marked only by badges that caught the light when they moved. The lead agent, tall and spare with a close-cropped haircut and eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. His voice carried without effort. He named the charges calmly. He named names. The CEO of North River Foods, a heavyset man with immaculate grooming and a smile practiced for earnings calls, rose halfway from his seat before realizing there was nowhere to go. The click of handcuffs sounded impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Cameras flashed. Someone in the gallery let out a breath they had been holding for years. Then the agent turned to the bench. "Robert Claiborne," he said, "you are under arrest for corruption and conspiracy." Claiborne's mouth opened, then closed. His hands shook as he stood. For a moment, he looked not angry, but small, as if the room had grown around him. The robe slid from his shoulders and pooled at his feet, black fabric against pale stone. He did not meet Marcus's eyes as he was led away. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with voices and light. Microphones jostled. Reporters shouted questions. Marcus stepped into the sun and felt its warmth on his face, uncomplicated and real. A headline would come later, "Young Lawyer Topples Corporate Giant." But in that instant, the words didn't matter. The work did. In the weeks that followed, change moved fast and then faster. North River Foods halted operations pending restructuring. Cleanup crews arrived in Millstone, their machines rumbling along the banks of the Elk Crow. The river was dredged, filtered, tested, and tested again. Fish returned first in small numbers, then schools. Children stood on the bridge and counted them. Emily Carter disappeared from the news by design. She entered witness protection with a single suitcase and a cautious hope. Free from the constant scan of exits, she slept for the first time in months. She cut her hair again, this time by choice, and learned to laugh without flinching. She would carry the past, but it would no longer carry her. Lena Morales stood at a podium a season later, accepting a journalism award she had never imagined winning. She spoke briefly about patterns, about listening to people who were told to be quiet, about sunlight. She dedicated the award to a town by a river. Marcus opened his firm in a modest building near the water. The sign simple: Read Environmental Justice. He took cases others passed over. He charged nothing where nothing could be paid. He hired carefully and taught generously. When people asked why, he told them the truth, that systems only change when someone decides to stand where the pressure is. On a clear afternoon, he walked along the Elk Crow's edge. The water moved cleanly now, reflecting sky and leaves. He took the photograph from his briefcase, the old one of his father on the riverbank, and held it until the light shifted. Then he put it back, smiled once, and kept walking. Justice, he had learned, was not quiet, but when it came in daylight. In the end, this story is not just about a courtroom, a verdict, or a billion-dollar company falling apart. It is about something much closer to our daily lives. It is about how easily we judge people by what we see instead of who they are. How often we mistake youth for weakness, silence for ignorance, or kindness for surrender. In everyday life, we all face moments when speaking up feels risky and staying quiet feels safer. This story reminds us that doing the right thing is rarely loud at first, but it always matters. Justice does not only live in courtrooms, it lives in how we treat our neighbors, how we listen to voices that are usually ignored, and how we choose honesty over convenience. You may never stand before a judge, but you will stand before choices that test your integrity. When you see something wrong, even something small, you have the power to make it right. Sometimes that power begins with simply refusing to look away. If this story moved you, let it move you to action. Share it with someone who needs encouragement. Speak up when silence feels easier. Support those who stand alone. And if you believe that truth still matters in a noisy world, please take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach people who need them. May God bless you, protect your families, and give you strength when you are called to stand for what is right. If you believe in justice, faith, and doing good even when it is difficult, leave a comment below and write Amen.